Thanks a lot. Well, I don't think Nick Cage has much competition here, so. Yeah, I'm Dave Anderson, and this is my company, and what we do is we do underwater exploration work. And we've done a lot of historic shipwreck work, actually all over the world. And also have another division that we do commercial work. We do commercial exploration work and that kind of thing. And that's what originally brought me to this area in the late 1980s, was oil and gas exploration work and seismic pipeline work and that kind of thing. So, whoops.
We, for some reason, turned off. So
Oh my God.
I'll fix you real quick.
Okay. So while he's doing that, what's really interesting about this area, and like I say, I came here in 1989, really didn't know much about the area, had traveled all over the world doing underwater work and a lot of historic shipwreck work and that kind of thing. And as I say, originally came here to do commercial work. But as I started to live here, and we lived down in the Gulf Shores, Bon Secours area, I became aware of the history of this place and just how deep it really is. And it was sort of amazing that there was so much maritime history here and so many maritime incidents, and yet had been very little work done on any of it that had really come forward in the public. There had been some academic work and that kind of thing, and there's some work by the Army Corps of Engineers in maintaining the Mobile Ship Channel and doing all their survey work to go along with it. But there hadn't been any work of any type of scale, I guess you might say. There have been some folks who have looked for some specific shipwrecks, such as the Pioneer II, for example, the Civil War submarine, the forerunner to the Hundley. There have been a few expeditions to look for that. But in the course of our commercial work here, we started to do some work closer inshore and discovered a number of very interesting, what we call anomalies. So when you're towing your survey gear, whatever it might be, whether it's side scan sonar, magnetometer, sub-bottom gear, or anything like that, you pretty much work always from the surface, towing a grid, basically. It's actually called mowing the lawn. You go down and back, and down and back, and down and back. And you can actually just run thousands of miles doing this in fairly tight patterns. Anyway, what happens is the gear produces data, and that data has certain signatures that can tell you a little bit about what you may have detected, and whether it might be a pipeline, or it might be an oil and gas pocket, or it might be a shipwreck, or it might be an artificial reef, that a bunch of old refrigerators somebody threw out there in the 1970s, and that kind of thing. So in our work here offshore, basically offshore of Dolphin Island and offshore of Fort Morgan, and from there seaward, we discovered a number of anomalies out there. And from there began my relationship with the Alabama Historic Commission. And we've been permit holders with them for many, many years now. So the things that I'm going to talk about today are actually joint collaboration efforts with the state of Alabama, between us as a private commercial entity and the public entity of the state. And how do this type of work is very expensive to do, and it's expensive, it's time consuming, it's weather dependent. And so in order to really make it function well, you need to, in my opinion, you need to find some marrying of public and private work to get it done, and that kind of thing. So, along that line, I'm also the executive director and one of the founding members of the Professional Marine Explorers Society. We're an international organization, and what we do is we bring together public and private entities to try to do this kind of work. We have a large education branch that does education based on underwater exploration and shipwrecks and oil and gas work and all those kinds of things. And so there's a lot of misconceptions, I think, between the responsible private side, the responsible commercial side of this kind of work, and the historic preservation community. And so what the Professional Marine Explorers Society does is it works to try to bridge that gap. And it also works for reasonable regulation and reasonable government regulation, reasonable laws, reasonable policies that can allow this kind of work to move forward. And as a quick example of that kind of work that we've done, recently here in Alabama, there was a push started a few years ago to modify Alabama's submerged cultural resources law. And it was a little bit of a misguided push, I might say. And had a lot of backing, had a lot of momentum. And so I got involved. I brought the Marine Explorers Society to the table, and we put together, whoops, there we go. We partnered with the CPAW organization, which here in Coalition to Protect Alabama's History. And we led the lobbying effort to defeat this legislation over the course of 3 different years. They put it up, we beat them, they put it up, they beat them, they put it up. And the last large defeat was culminated basically, it had made it through the House, it was in the Senate, and it looked like it was going to make it. And what we did was we put together a document that explained everything, printed it up, distributed it to every senator, and it died on the Senate floor. So what we managed to create here, and these are usually, when you have the commercial entity and the historic preservation entities, usually they're kind of at loggerheads. You know, there's some philosophical differences and that kind of thing. But we're all able to come together it's important for us to try to come together and realize the contributions that each side makes. And this fight here is a prime example of how that can work. We put, the coalition from Indian tribes to commercial entities like us, to universities, was extremely strong. And we were successful in beating back this challenge, which really would have devastated Alabama's underwater cultural resources law. It would have allowed relic hunting at Fort Morgan, for example, and that kind of thing. And Alabama has, 70,000 miles of waterway. And there's plenty of places in Alabama to go relic hunting if you want to go relic hunting. But you don't need to be relic hunting at Blakely, and you don't need to be relic hunting at Fort Morgan, and that kind of thing. So anyway, we were successful. And in the last 2 years, I guess this culminated 2 years ago. In the last 2 years, they haven't reintroduced this legislation, but of course, we're watching closely. Okay. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about shipwrecks. And so in the work that we've done off of Mobile, basically, or off of Fort Morgan and off of Dauphin Island, what you have there is you have the entrance to Mobile Bay. And the entrance to Mobile Bay, the shipping channel, is historically framed by 2 very, very dangerous sandbars. And this is actually the story of a ship that wrecked on one of those sandbars. So this is a little bit hard to see. I apologize but these old charts, this is a chart from the 1850s. And what you can see here, the thing to take away from this is the entrance to Mobile Bay. This is Dauphin Island. This is Fort Morgan Peninsula here. And this is the shipping channel. And what you notice here is that it has these sandbars that reach nearly 3 miles into the Gulf of Mexico. So what happens is if you're sailing along here, you're in 40, 50 feet of water and you're far enough offshore, everything looks great, and yet there's 12 feet of water in front of you. Very, very dangerous. The other thing to notice here is the layout of the shipping channel itself. We have the west bar and the east bar. This is Sand Island, where Sand Island Lighthouse is. That little dot right there is Sand Island Lighthouse in the 1850s. But if you notice the way the ship channel goes, it comes down here and it makes a dog leg to the southeast. Now, if you track the entrance to Mobile Bay all the way back to the 1600s, what you see here is this is a very dynamic area out here. It's always changing. But the ship channel has actually been moving. In the 1850s, it was where it is here. But if you back up 100 years before that, it actually dog-legged even harder over this way. So the Mobile Ship Channel has been gradually migrating to the west, south of Sand Island Lighthouse. So if you kind of take a look and see where it is now, dog-legging probably 20 degrees to the east, 25 degrees to the east. In 1892, it looked like this. So this is actually a gunnery ranging chart from Fort Morgan. And you can see how the dog leg is, there's the Sand Island Lighthouse. You can see how the dog leg is almost gone. It's almost straight. So in 40 years, these bars moved that far. So this is what, these are, to give you some scope here, these are 1 mile gunnery ranging circles from the guns at Fort Morgan. That's Dixie Island, where the clipper ship Dixie sank in 1860. That's why Dixie Bar is called Dixie Bar, and why it's spelled D-I-X-E-Y, not D-I-X-Y. It's actually for the sinking of the clipper ship Dixie, where some of her wreckage ended up here in September 1860. So the point here is to try to illustrate just how dynamic an area this is and how dangerous it is for mariners. So this is the area where we have done a tremendous amount of work out here. And it turns out that this area is what I call a ship catcher. This place is a dangerous place. It's a dangerous place today. I don't know if any of you guys offshore fish or anything like that. If you go out the ship channel, when the tide's running against you and you're going out the ship channel, you better hang on. Because even today, it's rough. And out here, it'll all be this. When the wind blows out of the southeast and out of the south, this will be a line of breakers across here. Across either side of this will be a line of breakers with the channel in between. Even today, it's a dangerous place to be. So in the course of all this work, we detected a lot of different anomalies, and we would what we would call dive and identify and that kind of thing. One of the difficult things out here, though, is the visibility is absolutely terrible. I mean, a lot of times it's like standing in the closet with the door shut. You can't see your hand in front of your face. Occasionally, things will lighten up a little bit. It hasn't rained for a while. You have you hit the tides right and that kind of thing. So one of these wrecks that we found, actually, this is part of one of them. These are actually barrels, and they're all stacked up. This is a very interesting shipwreck. You can see these are on end, and they're stacked. There's another one right there. This shows you a little bit more of them. This is on a good day. You can see these are not the greatest photos in the world, but this is actually on a good day when you can see something. So, and a lot of debris around and that kind of stuff. And on one of our dives for this one, usually when we dove this site, there were no visibility. You'd throw a few folks in the water, they'd be gone for 20 minutes, and they'd come back, and it was braille. All they could do was touch things. They had we have a very well-developed underwater mapping scheme for doing all these things, and my divers and myself, we can all work in the dark. But this wreckage pile is over 100 feet long, and it's very, very difficult to map and get your scaling and all those kinds of things when it's actually in the dark. We have some pretty highly developed techniques to do it, but it's extremely challenging. So, but when you have a day with some good visibility, you jump on it. And lo and behold, one of the things we saw laying out there in this middle of this wreckage pile was a bell. So this is actually a pretty good sized bell. So when that happened, we'd always been all this work was permitted under the Historic Commission. We went to the Historic Commission and said, You know, one of the ways to, first off, this is a really interesting artifact. There were shrimp net draped all over the top of this wreck, and it's a shrimp hang and that kind of thing. And this artifact was just laying there, and it could easily get caught in a shrimp net and drug off, and that kind of thing. Or if any other diver was to come and see it or whatever, it was going to disappear. So we put together a recovery and conservation plan for it. It's 31 inches tall and 700 pounds. We put together a archaeological recovery plan for it and worked with the Alabama Historic Commission to get it all permitted, and we went out and mapped it in place and recovered it. So these are, this is a quick sketch of, there's a lot more detailed sketches than this, but this one actually shows okay on slides. So you can see just how much was involved with this wreck. The main pile is approximately 110 feet long. It's a little difficult to get a super accurate measurement on it because it humps up pretty good off the bottom. But the main pile is about 110 feet long. There's more debris scattered off the north end. It goes out another 35 to 50 feet. What you have here, there's some very interesting things about this debris pile. If you're a shipwreck guy, shipwrecks are usually a pretty explosive event. You know, ships are sailing along, they just don't sink for no reason. Almost always they run into something, or a storm drives them ashore or something like that, and then they usually just get pounded to pieces. So normally with a normal ship, what I would call a normal shipwreck, you have a debris field, a large debris field. You have all kinds of scatters. The waves have pounded the ship to pieces and that kind of thing. You can think about a ship wrecking on a reef, for example, or a ship wrecking on a beach where in a storm where it just gets pounded to pieces. Its parts and pieces scatter up and down the beach and that kind of thing. This site wasn't like that at all. This site was really unusual. These barrels were stacked up stacked up one on top of the other. These stone slabs here are on edge. They're all stacked, they're stacked on edge just like they were when they were transported. These railroad axles and that kind of thing, all lined up together just like they would have been in the ship's hold. Very unusual, especially when you think about the place where this is. This is in a place that's deadly today. You go out there on the wrong day. So it was extremely odd. In fact, I've got to say that in all the years I've been doing this work, I've never seen anything self-contained like this. It's almost always you find something that, as I say, shipwrecks are explosive. Generally, they're explosive events. So this has piqued a lot of curiosity. And it took a while because we're doing all this mapping work in almost zero visibility. And the way we do it, we have a cartographer aboard the ship, and the divers have wireless communication gear where they talk back to the cartographer aboard the ship. And basically what you do is it's azimuth and distance off of baseline. So it's what they call baseline mapping, if you guys, any guys archaeology type folks or anything like that. It's baseline offset mapping is what we do, and you can work that kind of stuff even in low visibility. The diver doesn't really need to know, all he needs to know is his distance from a known point and his angle from a known point. And the cartographer aboard the ship draws the picture. He just calls it back up there and says, such and such an anchor at 50 feet and 90 degrees. And then over a period of time, those pictures evolve. And so anyway, this is a quick sketch of what's going on. So we put together a little expedition to go recover the bell. And this is actually me when I had hair. And that's an example of the kind of commo gear that we use here, is full face commo gear. You actually see this we've been using this for a long time, but you see it on Discovery Channel quite a bit now. Shark Week, you see guys wearing it and that kind of thing, but we've actually been using this gear since the 1990s. We tried to shoot underwater video, but the visibility was just awful. In fact, it was about a 0-0 day out there when the recovery trip left. And one of the other very difficult things about this is that this location is a location where you can only dive a couple times a month because of the way the tide's set up around here. You actually have to, the current rips so bad through here that you can't even get yourself to the bottom. And that kind of, I mean, you can try to crawl hand over hand and you can't get to the bottom if the tide's running in or out. And around here we have what's called a neap tide, which is a time that happens twice a month basically for about 4 to 9 days, twice a month. And out of those 4 to 9 days, the weather has to cooperate. It can't be, you know, thunderstormy or blowing or anything like that hard. So, we tried to shoot a bunch of underwater video of the bell recovery, but we were unsuccessful because the visibility was so bad. So our methodology for picking up the bell is, these are 500-pound lift bags here. They're teardrop-shaped lift bags. And one of the things you need to be careful of with this type of work is you have this really heavy object on the bottom and you have a boat with a crane on the surface, but the boat's always moving. Boat's riding up and down with the waves and all the rest of it. And if you hook your crane directly to the object that's on the bottom and the boat rolls up, it'll pick the object up off the bottom, and then when the boat rolls back down, it'll slam it back into the bottom. So you can do a lot of, if you don't know what you're doing, you can do a lot of damage to things. So our methodology for picking up stuff like this is we free float it to the surface using a lift bag setup. Many different setups, but here we use 2 500-pound lift bags to give us 1,000 pounds worth of lift. And then the boat and the object are both free floating together. And when the crane hooks to it and picks it up, even if the boat takes a roll, it won't go back down and hit the bottom. It'll just dip back in the water and come back up. So you can see this coming up. Now, just to give you some idea of scale, those bags are 5.5 feet tall. So that bell is, the bell itself is 31 inches in diameter, and off the top of my head I can't remember how tall it is, but you can get a little bit of idea of the scale of it from the lift bags there. So here it is, living in it come out of the water, goes right into its containment bin. So there's a conservation plan that needs to be put together for this. So when you deal with metallic objects or any type of objects that are submerged in a salt environment for a long period of time, you have to come up with a process to preserve them and clean them. And that process usually involves some type of soaking for a long period of time, certainly with large metal objects like this. So the bell came up and dropped right in its tank. This is coming home. This is my wife and partner here, Cindy. She's sitting in the back. And this is actually Stacy Hathorn, the Alabama State archaeologist, was aboard the boat for the recovery and that kind of thing. So this is as we're coming back. So it's a good time was had by all. So a day on the water it was absolutely gorgeous that day, and you just can't beat that. So we brought the bell back and we started cleaning on it now this looks pretty aggressive with a pressure washer and that kind of thing, but what it is, it runs at a low velocity, and you need to, in order to allow the soak to take place, you need to remove the heavy calcification and the heavy concretions from it, so that the chemicals that you soak it in can actually work on the metal. And so these things are usually very heavily encrusted. There's a few different ways you can go about removing that incrustation. But with something bronze like this, if you want to retain the patina on it, which you really do, you have to be very careful about how you clean it and preserve it. So for example, electrolytic reduction is a technique that's used to do conserve a lot of iron. It's like electroplating, but you run it backwards, and it will help to drive the concretions off the object, and also help to drive the chlorides out of the salt chlorides that get absorbed into it, will help to drive them out. But if you do it on bronze, it'll take the patina off, and you really don't want to do that. So you use a little bit more mechanically intensive method to remove the heavy concretions, and then we elected to use a, okay, so it's sodium with 3 carbons. Sodium sesquicarbonate soak basically is what we use. So you have sodium bicarbonate, sodium carbonate. The sodium carbonate, sodium with 1 carbon, sodium bicarbs with 2. Sodium sesquicarbonate is the chemical mixture that we use to preserve the bell. Whoop, there we go. Let me back up here. I'm going the wrong way. Let's see here. What do we do here? There we go. Okay, so in the process of this cleaning, this inscription on the bell came up, 1860. Now, I've done a lot of research around here into what might be here and the historic. When you look at these anomalies and the shipwrecks that we found and that kind of thing, and you try to figure out, okay, what is it? 1860 date on the bell threw me for a loop, because there was nothing in any of the historical documentation and any of the work that had been done that listed any type of wreck in that time period. The only thing that was around the 1860 time period was the Dixie, but she was in a completely different place. Her scenario of wrecking was very dramatic. She actually wrecked in the bay, and Dixie Island is named because pieces of her wreckage floated out the mouth of Mobile Bay and got hung on the bar. The actual wreckage of the Dixie is up in Mobile Bay. So we have this huge pile of wreckage that's all neatly stacked, and it's got something that certainly is not earlier than 1860, and yet none of the historical documentation, none of the compilations that have been put together of this area list anything happening during that time period. It's extremely unusual. We really went at this in the beginning with the idea that the wreck was a late 1800s, early 1900s wreck from what we could kind of see on the bottom. So the 1860 date on the bell really threw us and made us take a step back and kind of try to figure out, okay, well, what happened here? So this just gives you some idea of the bell. Now the hanger is still on it. The hanger is iron, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but you have to be, when you have dissimilar metals in a saltwater environment, it's like making a battery. And one of them is usually sacrificial to the other. So if you, for example, if any of you guys boat, you put zincs on the bottom of your boat, or on your outdrive and that kind of thing to keep the salt water from eating up the metals in your outdrive. The zinc is what they call the sacrificial anode, or the sacrificial, it will protect whatever since it's more electrically, it has a different electrical potential, it will protect it has different electrical potential from what it's attached to, it will protect that. It will corrode first. But what happens here is that when you put bronze and cast iron together, the cast iron protects the bronze. The cast iron corrodes before the bronze does. So if that cast iron hanger would have just been laying out there by itself and not attached to the bell, it would have been in much, much better shape. But as it was the only thing that was holding it together was the concretion that had grown around it over the years. There was basically just a shadow inside. When we finally were able to disassemble this, it took probably 1.5 years before we could disassemble this, running it through the preservation plan that we had. So the bell actually on it is from the Manili Bell Factory. So it says, what it says on it, it says Manili's. Let's see if I can get a picture of it here. It's a little hard to see. But it says Manili's, West Troy, New York on it. So that's actually pretty, there are no other inscriptions on it or anything like that. There was no inscription on it for where it was going to or anything like that. One of the interesting things here is that a bell this size is way too big to be a ship's bell. This is the type of bell that you would see in a town square. You would see this in a good-sized school. You wouldn't, or a large church. at 31 inches in diameter and 700 pounds. It's expensive. All these are custom made. This is not an item that they stack in warehouses and things like that. They're all custom made for the owner and that kind of thing. It's actually, this bell's in the key of B, which is pretty interesting. So the Meneely Bell Foundry was actually a very famous bell foundry in upstate New York, right outside Albany, in a place called West Troy. And so there's a lot of the foundry, that was our first clue anyway of start to look. Let's see if we can get some Meneely Bell Foundry records and figure out maybe who they sold the bell to in the 1859, 1858, 1859 time frame. And, but it turned out that the Meneely Bell Company went out of business in the 1950s. They're an extremely famous company. They made, in fact, Denny Chimes is our Meneely Bell, that kind of thing. The Carillon at Cornell University is Meneely. They're very famous bell company. They made the replacement for the Liberty Bell after it cracked and that kind of thing. But they finally went out of business. They started in the early 1800s and they finally did go out of business around 1950. And if anybody can date that car, you can get some idea of when this picture was taken. So, come here. So the bell gives us a hint, and but the Meneely stuff turned out to be a dead end. But not really a dead end, because it actually turned out to be very, very interesting. This bell turned out to be a very unique bell, even though we still don't know what ship it was on or anything like. At this time, we don't know what ship it was on or anything like that. But it turned out that, and there's a better shot of it. You can see Meneely's and then West Troy, New York. So that's actually a town called Watervliet now, right there on the Hudson River in Albany, New York. What was really interesting about this bell was how it was made. This was a transitional period for building bells, and at the top of this bell you see these hoops. These are actually called the horns, and so bell making has been around for thousands of years, and the techniques are pretty much the same. They really haven't changed. They're sand cast individually, and you would see this type of mounting arrangement on bells in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, where you would run ropes through here and tie the bell to a cross beam, basically, and then tilt the beam. But in the 1800s, they started having people had always had a lot of trouble with bells cracking, because a clapper would always hit the bell in the same place again and again and again, and that's why the Liberty Bell cracked. So there was a technological rush, I guess you might say, to see who could come up with a hanger where you could rotate the bell. When you put this thing up in a bell tower, it weighs 800 pounds and that kind of thing. It's no easy job to pick it up and move it once it's up there and that kind of thing. So there was, the Meneely Company was actually the first company to actually patent a rotating bell hanger, where you could, what they did was, this is the first patent here, and I apologize, it's a little bit out of focus. But basically what they did was they took a bell with horns on it, and they U-bolted it to a hanger where you could loosen up the U-bolts and drop it down. This is kind of like a socket set up here, where it pulls itself up into this socket and gets tight in here and then stays in one place. You could actually drop it down on this long bolt through the center here. You can undo the U-bolts, drop it down on the long bolt through the center, and turn it. And then use the long bolt through the center and hoist it back up into its socket and put the U-bolts back on, and it would hold it in place again. So you could turn it 90 degrees at a time, all the way around in a circle. So this is actually, that is the hanger that was on this bell, one of these original Meneely hangers. And it's really a shame that it was in such bad shape that there really wasn't anything we could do with it. But this is basically the setup that we had. Bells today are not built anything like this. What they have is a center post that fits up in a socket in the top here. This whole horn arrangement is completely gone now. So, and there you can see it. And it's a little hard to see here, but actually to make this bite into its receiver socket, there's little ridges that are cast in the very top of here, where it would actually, when you pulled it up in, it would bite into that cast iron at the top. So now we got a pretty big mystery on our hands. We have this bell that's for sure, it's not before 1860, and but there isn't anything going, there's nothing in any historical record or anything like that, so we start our search basically. And that search actually here started in newspaper archives. And we ended up finding in the Mobile Register, June 7th, 1861, an entry that talks about a schooner that gets captured off of Fort Morgan. So if you think about this, so in 1860, Lincoln gets elected, fall of 1860. He hasn't even get inaugurated yet, and the South secedes. Everybody knows war is coming. The whole world knows that war is coming to the U.S. And cotton prices start to skyrocket in the South, just like any commodity that's going to be limited. There's speculation and all those kinds of things about it. Mobile at that time, #1 cotton exporting port in the South. So cotton prices are jumping at this time. People know the war's coming. Fort Sumter happens in April of '61. So, and then Lincoln orders the blockade. So the blockaders actually arrive here. They arrive in Pensacola in late May of 1861. And they start working their way west. So it's very hard to read here, but there's an incident out there off of Fort Morgan where a salvage ship called the Schooner Aid, if you can see this here, Schooner Aid, belonging to Peter Rosencrantz, hired for John Foote to strip the British bark Amstel. And the Schooner Aid had been captured. So, and this actually, so there's a shipwreck out there that this salvage boat has been hired to go and strip, basically. But he gets captured by the Union blockaders who have just arrived here. And they're in two big ocean-going steam-powered ships. The USS Niagara, SS Niagara, and the Mount Vernon. And so basically what happens is the captain of the Aid goes out there to salvage this British ship that he's been contracted to salvage and get the cargo off of. And the Union blockaders go over there and capture his ship, put him and his 22 men in a longboat and make him row to Fort Morgan. So, and it turns out that that's just a picture of a bark. So barks were like the trucks of the sea at that time. These are a very common sailing ship, usually 3 or 4 masted, heavy cargo carrying and that kind of thing. So this is a similar ship to the Amstel. So we did some more work, and actually at Cornell University, we found the captain's logs for the Niagara. And so this is actually an entity, and I don't know how to focus this, but basically what this says is that can you tweak that just a little bit? I don't know if we can get it any better or not. I don't know. I can just read it to you real quick here. So it says at 1 p.m., so this is from Captain William McKean, who's the captain of the Niagara. He says, June 5 at 1 p.m., observing operations of a suspicious character going on board a hulk lying between Dolphin and Sand Islands, and that communication was taking place with a schooner anchored near her, sent the Mount Vernon and our 2nd and 4th cutters and the Dolphin in tow to examine the hulk and cut out the schooner from 6 to 8 p.m. Okay, the boat expedition returned with the Schooner Aid of Mobile as a prize. So the poor captain of the Aid, who thought he had a salvage job, he was going to go make some money, doesn't make any money, and he actually loses his boat. Now the Aid actually was a pretty famous boat here along the coast. She wasn't very old. She's about 90 foot and was about 5 or 6 years old. Very good condition and that kind of thing. And so the captain's next entry, he says, a schooner is supposed to be armed and having a number of men on her deck had been seen for a number of days beating past about the harbor of Mobile, which is just at Fort Morgan, basically, is what he means there. Okay, just within the bar. Yesterday morning, she was discovered becalmed alongside the wreck of a large ship, with a number of hands apparently engaged in dismantling her. Lieutenant Guest DeCraft and Lieutenant Butler of the Marines and Midshipmen O'Keefe, Swain, and Casey were dispatched in 3 boats to cut out. The boats being towed in near the bar by the steamer Mount Vernon. They reached the schooner about 3 o'clock, took possession, and brought her out. She is not armed, but is strong-built and well-found vessel of about 100 tons called the Aid and belongs to Mobile. So now he's going to say something to kind of cover his butt, because he just confiscated a commercial vessel. He didn't confiscate a warship or anything like that. He confiscated a commercial vessel, okay, which is sort of on the edge of the rules of engagement here. So he writes this next paragraph because he said, had I not supposed she was armed, I would have not set after her. I feel justified, however, in keeping her, as the enemy have captured several of our vessels in the Mississippi. She sails fast, and I propose to mount a 24-pounder howitzer upon her. She could carry along 32-pounders, so she was big enough to carry a 32-pound howitzer on her, and employ her to aid in the blockade until the arrival of the flag officer, where she can be restored or sent to Key West for adjudication as he may deem best. So Captain McKean's trying to cover his butt here, because he knows he took a step and he confiscated this merchant ship. But he also knows that if he's going to enforce the blockaders came here in these big ocean-going ships. But the blockade runners here, anybody who was going to run the blockade, those ocean-going ships were large and deep draft. And you had to be able to get in close in the swash channels along the shore if you're really going to enforce the blockade, because the blockade runners will just run in shallower water than these big ocean-going ships, and there's nothing that they can do. So the captains of the Union blockade ships had a mandate to, if they were going to really work the blockade and enforce it, they were going to have to find ships that could run close and enforce the blockade. So they went after ships like the Aid, and just for whatever reason, they could make up in order to confiscate these ships. I mean, the guy with the guns makes the rules here, and they would confiscate these coastal sailing schooners. And that's exactly what they did. What's really interesting about this is a little hard to see, but this is a listing of the Union blockader ships, and you can see that the Niagara is a first-rate ship of 4,500 tons. She is a big ship, crews just under 400 people. And the Mount Vernon is about a tenth of her size at about 800 tons, or 20% of her size at about 800 tons. So they're both big ocean-going steam-powered ships. What's really interesting is that they drew a lithograph of this incident. The Union did. So in our research, we came across this lithograph. Of course, it wasn't annotated at that time. But what you see here is you see the Mount Vernon, and you can see she's a big ocean-going steamship. There's Fort Morgan. There's Sand Island Lighthouse. There's the British bark Amstel sitting on her side in the water, 3 masts in the air. And there's the schooner Aid, and here you have the longboats rowing over to her, and here you have a channel marker buoy. So this gives you some real perspective on kind of what happened and that kind of thing. And so this is actually drawn by, this is in the Naval Archives actually, drawn by I think a lieutenant off the Mount Vernon drew this. So what's interesting here is when you take this picture here of this ship just sitting out there on the bar, and then you look at the wreckage as it's laid out on the bottom. Again, not an explosive event. and that kind of thing. You start to think about, well, how did this really even get sunk? And what happened is this vessel came in without a bar pilot. They were trying to get to Mobile under the blockade. They had a load of commercial cargo, and they were trying the Cotton Triangle trade from the south to Europe, from the south to Europe with cotton, from Europe to the East Coast with trade goods, from the East Coast back to the south with trade goods again. And that was the lucrative Cotton Triangle. You would make more money on the cotton trip than you'd make on the other two trips combined. So there was a huge, remember I said there was at this time, Mobile became the #1 cotton exporting port in the South. In the fall of '60 to the blockade in '61, Mobile tripled its cotton exports. There was a huge push of ships to get here, European ships, to get here and get cotton. Anybody that had anything to float was heading for the South to get a load of cotton and get back to Europe before the blockade came down. So these guys came in and didn't get a bar pilot. And remember that dog leg in the ship channel we talked about earlier? It's pretty easy to miss that. And if you miss it, you're going to end up on that bar and you're not getting off. The way the wind and tide run around here, it'll just keep pushing you up on it and pushing you up on it. So this vessel actually sat on top of this bar and just fell to pieces. She didn't get pounded up in a hurricane. There were no hurricanes that summer or anything like that. She just sat there and fell to pieces. The schooner Aid tried to salvage her and failed. And nobody else could get out here. The Union was here, so the vessel just sat on the bar until she fell to pieces. And that's why the cargo is in such a neat arrangement on the bottom. So, okay. Anyway, it's pretty interesting. So, I remember I was talking about that the captain said he was going to put some guns on the schooner Aid and that kind of thing. He sure did, because in the Times-Picayune for July 6th of that year, it says, we conversed with a gentleman who witnessed the capture of some vessels named below, whose account is that on the last Sunday a week, a craft supposed to be the captured schooner Aid ran the schooners John Arthur, Major Rainey, Pelican, and California into Biloxi, and then captured the Fanny loaded with railroad iron from Mobile, the Olive Braneb with naval stores for New Orleans, the Basilide with brick for Fort Gaines, another vessel with salt and hay, and another with railroad iron for Mobile, and two more not directly remembered, also a Mexican schooner with flour for a Mexican port. So the Aid became extremely busy within a month enforcing the blockade off of Mobile, or off of Biloxi. So the final demise of the Aid is actually, they sunk her in Santa Rosa Pass, to block Santa Rosa Pass in late August of that year of '61. So the captain here was actually pretty smart, because he couldn't get in trouble. There was a whole court for adjudicating these kinds of things after the war, when the Union would confiscate these vessels and that kind of stuff. The vessel owners could, at the end of the war, the vessel owners could go to this adjudication court and get money from the government, from the Union, for the loss of their vessels. Well, the captain of the Niagara took care of that. He just sunk that. He took it over to Santa Rosa Sound and sunk it to block the sound. So there was nothing to adjudicate when it was all over. So, okay. So what gets really interesting here is that if you remember back to that first newspaper article, he talks about that he was salvaging a British ship. Now the British he called it directly the British bark Amstel. And what's interesting about that is that the English have a really strong shipping register. All these cargoes were insured. Nobody would put their cargo aboard a ship that didn't carry insurance or anything like that. So there was actually an insurance registry, Lloyd's Register and Lloyd's List, where ships were all rated for what kind of condition they were in, how much cargo they could carry, and all the rest of it. So these records in England are very extensive, Lloyd's List and Lloyd's Register records. There's no ship Amstel listed on any of those records. Very strange. And so we went up, down, and sideways trying to figure out what in the world was going on, because they were emphatic that it was an English ship, and that's not really the mistake that you would make. So one of the things that came up with was I looked for any ship in England that was ever named Amstel, and there were none. I said, well, you know, Amstel's actually a Dutch name. It's the Amstel River in Amsterdam. And, you know, that's where Amstel beer comes from. And I said, well, maybe she was a Dutch ship that had been recently sold to an English company. Remember this big push of getting ships here to the U.S. for cotton and that kind of thing. So maybe she was a Dutch ship that had been recently sold to an English company, and that it took a while for this to filter through the register. Now the Dutch had their own register and their own insurance, a Dutch East India Company, for example, and that kind of thing. So the Dutch had their totally separate, their own register. Only problem is it's in Dutch. So, but we got a researcher in Holland, and lo and behold, this is pretty hard to read, but here's the bark Amstel, owned and built by the Bossevane Company in 1849 for Knock near England, sold to England in 1860. So there it was. There actually was a bark Amstel. It was an English vessel, but not on any English registers, because she still carried all of her Dutch registry stuff and her Dutch insurance and that kind of thing. Probably had just been sold. This is probably the first trip that she made after she had been sold. And so that kind of closed the door a little bit on the Amstel's history is very interesting. She was a Dutch East India Company ship, spent most of her time in the Far East, in Jakarta, and running trade routes in the South China Sea. And she had come back to Liverpool, England for some repairs, had run a route back to Liverpool for some repairs, and that's when she was sold. She was actually sold in the dry dock when she was in Liverpool, and in 1860. So, but again, why there aren't many mentions of her in any English journals or anything like that is because she spent almost all of her time in the Far East. So this is just a little display we put together for the Bell. This is actually in Gulf Shores for a while. This is at the entrance to Lulu's there. We had a press conference with the Bell and that kind of thing, and with the Alabama Historic Commission when we first brought this forward. We didn't have all this information at that time. We were still developing the story. And actually the story is still developing. We have a researcher in England now, and I think that if everything works out right this summer, late this summer, we'll have a lot more information on her. There's still a huge mystery about her cargo. You have all this building material in her cargo, and it's obviously material that's going for some type of large, it's obvious to me anyway, but it's obvious to me that it's material that's going for some large construction project somewhere, whether it's a big public building or a university or something like that. And all the stone on her is very interesting. You know, it's the height of the antebellum period, and custom stonework is extremely popular and that kind of thing. And so what we're hoping to do is learn more about her cargo and where it was going. We still haven't figured out where the Bell, who the final customer for the Bell was. Where was it going? And that kind of thing. So we're hoping that this English research that we're working with right now will help to shed a little bit more light on that. And maybe by the end of this year or something, we'll know a little more. So this is actually, so we employ a professional team here. This is Jim Sinclair. He's our principal investigator, lead archaeologist. Jim and I have worked together since the 1980s. He's dove the Titanic. You know, I tried to get on that trip. I tried. But, you know, just done some really great projects over the years and that kind of thing, and he's our head principal investigator. And of course, we have other professionals that work with us also. But this was at the press conference there. And you've already just seen that slide. This is just some artwork that tells a little bit about the story of the Bell and that kind of thing. And we're done. Okay, so the Bell is now at our facility in Gulf Shores. So that's where it's at. It's kind of waiting its next, where it will end up next.
You definitely established that bell was on that ship. It looks awfully big for me, an amateur, you know.
Well, it's not a ship's bell, so it was just general cargo.
Were they delivering it?
We don't know yet. So that's one of the big questions here is, and one of the big remaining mysteries is where was all this material going? So a bark at that time, it could carry 100 tons worth of material aboard that ship. A lot of material. For example, those stone slabs, they weigh over a ton apiece. So the bell at 700 pounds is not very much weight for a ship of this class to be carrying and that kind of thing. But it is much, much too large to be a ship's bell. Sure.
How often do you find human or livestock skeletons?
Very, very rare. Almost, I would say that never. Well, I can't say never. So we found some pig bones on some Spanish ships in the Caribbean, but they were buried up and that kind of thing. I've never found human remains on a ship ever. And I mean, the ocean environment is it recycles. Organic matter in the ocean environment does not last long unless for some reason it gets buried up or something like that. And that's what actually happened at that one site in the Caribbean. In Jamaica, it got buried up in a bunch of mud. And there were some pig bones there, but there were no human remains ever found.
Were there skeletons on the Hunley?
Yes, there were. But that was a contained environment. So the sea creature, the crabs and the fish and everything like that couldn't get in the Hunley. Yes, there were skeletons on the Hunley.
Let me change subject a minute there. First, you said you've done a lot of work around here. Did your company do any diving in Bottle Creek at the Indian Mountain site a few years ago?
No, we did not.
I pulled up there one day to go hunting and there was somebody in two boats doing diving. In the creek itself, said they were looking.
Huh. Well, they could have been.
They said exploration zone.
Really? Wasn't us. So all the work that we do in the state of Alabama is permitted through the Alabama Historic Commission. We are above board with everything we do, so we don't do small stuff like that, I guess you might say, without the proper authorization and proper permitting. Go ahead.
What was the depth you were working at when you approached it?
It's not very deep, about 30 feet.
So what would be the normal draft for a boat of that size?
A boat of that size would have been drafting about 19. But the bar, there was 7 feet of water there when she smashed up. So back in that earlier slide where I showed that dog leg, to come in Mobile without a bar pilot is a foolish mistake and that kind of thing. And my theory on it is they knew the blockaders were in Mobile, or not in Mobile, but they knew they were in Pensacola, and they just needed to get in. They were, at any moment they could arrive here. So normally what you would do is you would go out and anchor up, and then you would wait for a bar pilot to come out to you, and then bar pilot would guide you up the channel, make the dog leg, and up into the bay. They tried to do it on their own. And there's actually no bar pilot record of any pilot ever being aboard this vessel either. That's one of the other things about it. You could dig back through all that and look for it, and there was no record of a bar pilot ever being on her. So.
How do you decide where to go on your ship?
Well, it depends. If you can look for areas that should have a high concentration of things. So, for example, this area. With Mobile Bar set up the way it is and that kind of thing, it's a ship catcher. There are literally, people smash up there today and that kind of thing. And they get off and that kind of stuff. But I've seen crew boats go aground out there, servicing the rigs and that kind of thing. All you got to do is not pay attention a little bit, go get a cup of coffee when you shouldn't or something like that, and you can end up in 5 feet of water out there. So it's still a very dangerous place today. Sure.
Is there equipment here locally?
Yeah.
Let's get you up to the Huntsville Tuscaloosa project.
Sure. Sure. In fact, I've talked to Sid Shell about that, and yeah. Go ahead.
The war has begun, so what happens to the captain and the crew?
They went back to England. So this is what my researcher in England is hunting. Okay, so the Amstel was an insured vessel, and this is so. I said, look, somebody paid off on her when she. Yeah, I mean, somebody paid here. So follow the money. And so I said her logbook and all the rest of this, in order to file an insurance claim on her, and the claim would have been filed in Europe, would not have been filed in the United States. They had to get back to Europe. And that's what we're on the trail of right now, is where, how the insurance claim was handled, who insured her, and basically we're pulling on those strings to see what we can find.
But in the eyes of the North, were those crew members and officers combatants?
No, that's why they let them all go. So they let them all go, they put them in a rowboat and made them row to Fort Morgan. There was 22 or 23 of them, including the captain.
Why weren't they combatants if they were running the blockade?
But they weren't running the blockade. All they were doing was salvaging that ship. So they didn't have, for example...
I mean the guys on the Amstel.
Well, I guess you could say because the blockaders hadn't quite gotten here yet. And she was already aground, so they didn't know how long she'd been aground and that kind of thing. And even, so with blockade runners with foreign crews, this was a big, in the beginning of the blockade, it's actually very interesting to read the captain's logs from a lot of these blockading ships. They weren't really well trained in what to do here. Like they knew they had to come down here and they needed to stop shipping. So, but there's this human problem that you have. What do you do with all the people? So for example, off New Orleans and off Texas, there were captains that captured a lot of blockade runners that were, they were just, remember the blockade came down and ships are in transit when this is happening. So you have this transition period between when normal commerce is trying to get to the south or get to southern ports, and when the blockade comes down, there's a lot of ships that are just in transit. There's a lot of passages that are booked and all the rest of it. So when the Union blockaders first get here, what do they do with all of that? What do they do with all those people? So there's actually a number of instances where these blockade ships have had to take women and children on board because they were passengers in some ship that they turned away and wouldn't let get to its port. So say you're coming from Caracas, for example, or something like that, and you're coming to New Orleans. You've been at sea for a month, your stores are running low and that kind of thing, and the blockade stops you, so you have this humanitarian crisis basically. If they don't let the ship into the port and that kind of thing, what does the Union captain do with all the people? And it's actually very interesting to read through these logbooks and watch these guys, these people, try to make these kinds of decisions. And they agonize over it. What do I do with these people? I have a woman with a sick child, I have this, I have that. So until the blockade until enough time went by where the only people coming in were actually attempting to run the blockade, they had to have somewhat, I guess, a lenient position, you might say, about it all. Plus, the captain doesn't have any place to put them anyway. If you kind of think about it, he's got 350 people aboard his ship. What's he going to do with 20 more who are prisoners? Where's he going to take them? The closest place to take them is Key West. And so each captain had to try to come up with his own methodology for how he was going to deal with this. But I think what's very interesting is Captain McKean's #1 priority was getting the aid, was getting that ship and crewing her up, putting his guys on it, putting his guns on it and that kind of thing. So she could actually be the enforcer. And that's exactly what she did a month later off Biloxi. Sure, go ahead.
What do y'all do with the information and the artifacts y'all collect?
So the information, we submit reports, regular reports to the state and all that kinds of stuff. Our archaeological team does all of that basically and that kind of thing. The artifacts and all that stuff is it's being collected. We haven't really salvaged very much off of recovered very much off of the Amstel at all. There's been a lot of things going on. There was a federal court case about it that we were involved in. There were some other claimants that came forward and attempted to claim her, and that took a number of years to get that worked out. So right now there is no solid determination. Sure.
Do you know what's in the barrel?
No. But we have some ideas. There's a lot of railroad material on here. She's got a general commercial cargo kind of thing. I think a lot of them are railroad spikes. A lot of them may be food stores also, which would just concrete together and that kind of thing. It's a little hard to tell. But when you say you run your metal detection gear over them and that kind of thing, the ones that you assume are full of like railroad spikes and stuff like that, they ring pretty hard. And that, but you have to be, so this is an archaeological recovery, it's not a salvage where you're just out there snatching things off the bottom and that kind of thing. So you have to, when you bring these things up, you have to be in the position to see them through, basically, through their conservation and preservation period and that kind of stuff. So we're very careful about what we bring up and what we don't. And there's a lot of planning involved with that kind of stuff. Pardon? So we are privately funded. Most of the funding comes from my other work, to be honest with you. This project here has cost a lot of money. And that kind of thing, but it's something that we really enjoy and something that we're hoping to, at some time or another, have some type of economic model around it. But at the present time, it's all privately funded.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay.